Good morning, I'm Dave Christie with your LaRouche organization update for Friday, August 8th. Now, later this evening, 80 years ago, we would have heard the news that the second atomic weapon was dropped on Nagasaki. That, of course, occurred in Japan time on August 9th. But we would have heard about it today. Now, as we have since found out, and as was published in the 1946 United States Strategic Bombing Survey, those weapons were completely unnecessary as the Japanese had already agreed to the terms of surrender that they did agree to after the dropping of the bombs. Now, if you have read the LaRouche organization new pamphlet, the new white paper that we have put out entitled Worse Than Treason, the Actual Motive Behind Russiagate, you would know that the British, who were advocates for dropping those weapons to enforce their later post-World War II imperial rule under the dynamics of the Cold War, that already before those bombs were dropped, in the Pacific theater of the war was over, the British were already planning to invade the Soviet Union under what was called Operation Unthinkable. And those plans were designed by Winston Churchill, who stated that the overall objective of that was, quote, "The overall political object is to impose upon Russia the will of the United States and the British Empire." Now, as we know, Churchill did not get Operation Unthinkable to move forward, but instead lowered the Iron Curtain and divided us against the allies that we had worked with in the Soviet Union and China to defeat the fascist scourge and the Nazis and so on that the British had previously played footsie with. Recall that there were advocates in the City of London and the British monarchy that wanted to use Hitler as a force to destroy the Soviet Union as part of their long-term geopolitical games designed by the likes of Halford Mackinder and so on to conquer the Eurasian heartland and rule the world. That was the aims of the ancient British imperial designs. But as Churchill was also lowering the Iron Curtain, he was establishing the empires of the mind, which would be instrumental in crafting the psychological warfare and infiltrating various layers of society through academia and, of course, our military to use the United States as the next phase of the war against the Soviet Union, and today, of course, Russia, as well as China. Now, I'm going to cover a little bit of the elements of that psychological warfare, particularly through the cyber aspect, since this does relate to what we have launched as a flank to expose the British roots of the Russiagate operation. Now, many of you who have already dove into that white paper on Russiagate which again is very clear in exposing that this wasn't just about Donald Trump. This was about continuing the proxy war in Ukraine to use the Ukrainian people as the force to destroy destroy Russia, assumedly, well, and of course to move on to China after that. Now, as concerning the cyber side of this, I want to cover one of the aspects of one of the agents of enforcing Churchill's empires of the mind, which is John Rawlings Rees. Now, he was the head of he was a brigadier general in the British Army, but he was the head of the Tavistock Institute, which was based in London. This was one of the key centers of psychological warfare. And in 1945, he published a piece called The Shaping of Psychiatry by War. Now, that piece is very clear in its intent to create eventually what were called the shock troops of Tavistock operatives that would infiltrate the various layers of academia, media networks, polling outfits, and so on to tackle what John Rawlings Rees called the problems of peace. And this, of course, was the problem that, we could actually have a peaceful relations with the former allies that we had in the defeat of the Nazis and those in the militaristic Japanese grouping, obviously Russia and China, and to pit us against them. And I just want to cover one aspect, given the cyber dimension of the whole Russiagate phenomena, and as it relates to John Rawlings Rees. He had what was called the Moreno Brigades. This was one of John Rawlings Rees's psychological warfare units. Now, the Moreno Brigade was named after Jacob Moreno. He's not a well-known name. He is considered one of the founders of psychodrama and the related sociodrama. That's a whole other aspect. But one of the things that Moreno did was form a group called Sociometry. This was leading academics such as John Dewey. It included people from the media domain, such as Frank Stanton of CBS. Also polling agencies like George Gallup was a part of Sociometry. That's, of course, Gallup polls. And a whole slew of U.S.-based Tavistock operatives such as Kurt Lewin, Paul Lazarsfeld, Margaret Mead. And these are the people who, out from Sociometry, would form the nucleus of the various public relations firms that would be designed in creating the media narratives for war, running the political campaigns for the political operatives that would dutifully engage in these various wars, the different regime change operations that we saw during the Cold War, whether it be the overthrow of the government of Iran, other governments in South America and throughout the world. And of course, now that has continued through cyber methods. Now, the other aspect of what occurred with Sociometry, that is of Jacob Moreno's Sociometry, was the formation of some of those same personnel of Sociometry went on to form the International Network of Social Network Analysis. And you will find social network analysis in U.S. military counterinsurgency guides as part of their counterinsurgency policy. And what this did, social network analysis, essentially mapped out the nature of insurgent networks, and then, of course, identified the parts of it that would need to be neutralized and so on. But really what it was a core of the regime change program. Now, many members of this social network analysis grouping formed in the late 60s, early 70s, and again had earlier been a part of Sociometry. These were people from the cybernetics grouping and so on. But what they went on to do is create, working with DARPA, they created the various technologies and so on that we now know as social media, and of course the tools of social network analysis to identify what the social networks and how people interacted on social media and so on. And this became instrumental for the various regime change operations, whether it be the Arab Spring or the Maidan and so on. So how does this relate to Russiagate? Well, we don't know exactly, but I would like to just call attention that concerning the releases that we've had so far from Tulsi Gabbard and the DNI office on the documents that went into Obama's coup d'etat as it was planned by John Brennan and Jim Clapper and others within the so-called deep state around Obama. It's now, as we know, the intelligence community assessment initially had little confidence, even from the NSA and FBI, that the Russian cyber operations had any impact on that election. Now, what we've since found out is that, of course, Brennan disagreed with that, as well as the assessment they had in the confidence of the Steele dossier, this piece of garbage that should be obviously clear that it was a piece of garbage. Anyway, what we've learned is that Brennan pulled together 5 analysts to rewrite the intelligence community assessment to back up the idea that Russia indeed was involved in cyber operations and various attempts to influence the election. Now, at the core of that, of course, was the narrative that the Russian GRU hacked the DNC, released emails that embarrassed Hillary Clinton, released those emails to WikiLeaks, and therefore got their compromat victim, Donald Trump, installed into the White House. Now, as it turns out, one of those, the 5 analysts that helped do the rewrite and include these various cyber operations by Russia, which have since been thoroughly discredited, including by CrowdStrike, the president of it, Sean Henry, who was supposedly, they were the ones that had discovered the DNC hack, actually admitted to Congress in 2017 that there was no evidence that Russia indeed had hacked the election or hacked the DNC and so on. But anyway, one of those 5 analysts working with Brennan was a guy named Gavin Wild, who is a Russia specialist at NSA. As it turns out, Gavin Wild was also a member of the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command, who had a program called the Election Security Group. And Gavin Wild was a member of that in the 2018 midterms as well as the 2020 election. And that's according to CyberScoop. The Election Security Group had a co-lead from NSA, which for the 2018 midterms was a woman named Ann Neuberger. She went on to have a leading cyber role in the Biden administration. And the co-lead from U.S. Cyber Command was General Timothy Hawk. He was just fired as the head of NSA, U.S. Cyber Command, Central Security Service earlier this year. The Election Security Group, little of what we know of it, they partnered heavily with CISA and FBI. Of course, we know that the operatives of CISA and FBI went on to become as identified within congressional investigations and so on. They leaned very heavily on social media companies to get, and Silicon Valley in general, to ensure that accounts that raised questions of the legitimacy of the 2020 elections and other matters, including the whole matter of anyone that dared say that Russia, that NATO expansion may have been involved in the Russian operation inside of Ukraine. Anyway, those accounts of anyone that dared question the election or other matters were censored. This was what was called the censorship industrial complex. But I think it's relevant to just recognize that some of these operatives, such as the most recent director of CISA, Jen Easterly, she was involved together with Paul Nakasone, who was the previous head of NSA U.S. Cyber Command before Timothy Hawk. These were Nakasone and Easterly. They were of the self-identified 4 horsemen, they called themselves, who were the ones that established U.S. Cyber Command in 2010. Ann Neuberger, the NSA co-lead of the Election Security Group, she says that she actually led that team of those that formed U.S. Cyber Command back in 2010 under the leadership of Keith Alexander at the time, who was the head of NSA, and then the dual-hatted head of NSA U.S. Cyber Command. Anyway, this grouping You know, if you consider what U.S. Cyber Command was involved in, whether it be the Arab Spring, the Maidan operations, we of course know that social media companies and others within Silicon Valley were tapped for their expertise in leading those various regime change operations. And so I would say certainly one would wonder if the similar model of regime change operations that was being led internationally was applied in the case of the United States concerning what occurred around Russiagate and so on. That is, I think, a question that should be asked, given that we know that Gavin Wild, who was a member of this election security group, was involved in the Brennan rewrite of the ICA, of the Intelligence Community Assessment, that justified Obama launching his small group operation that began crafting the narratives that became known as Russiagate. So that's something that bears further investigation. But I think that this goes to the importance of really what is at the core of the LaRouche Organization white paper, that on the true nature of Russiagate, what is actually behind it, which again, as that identifies, is the long-standing British policy to orchestrate the United States, to use the United States as the brawn for the British brains for their geopolitical games. And it has always been about the destruction of Russia, as it was under Churchill, as he laid out through the Cold War, as he intended with Operation Unthinkable to invade the Soviet Union back in 1945, as early as July. That was the intention. However, since that didn't work, the Cold War was initiated. The empires of the mind and the various psychological warfare elements using the fear of nuclear weapons as a coercive attempt, that apparatus has been behind the present drive for nuclear war. I should just add, given that we do have the potential of the summit between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, we don't know what that will look like. There's all kinds of questions of whether Zelensky will be there. The British, Ben Wallace, of the former UK defense minister, is demanding that Europe must have some representation. I'm sure they'd love to have, the head of MI6 there to do their part in sabotaging these the dialogue between Trump and Putin and potentially Zelensky. We'll have to see where all of this goes. But the other component of this is that this is an important step, the fact that the dialogue is occurring, particularly given the dangers of the nuclear dimensions right now. But as Helga Tsepp-LaRouche had put out and is circulating a petition for, which all of you should sign and circulate, what needs to happen is for Trump to sit down with Putin and Xi Jinping to craft a new development and security architecture for the entire planet that takes all nations' considerations in and deals with the impending financial collapse of the transatlantic system, which of course is the driver behind the British and deep state operatives in the United States, behind the war drive against both Russia and China. So circulate that petition. Circulate our white paper on the Russiagate and the true cause behind it, the geopolitical considerations behind Russiagate. But otherwise, join the International Peace Coalition meeting today. It will be an important meeting of some of the leading figures that exposed Russiagate, such as former NSA technical director Bill Binney, as well as his associate at NSA, Kirk Wiebe. Both Binney and Wiebe were involved in exposing the fact that the hack could never have happened. Also, Ray McGovern will be involved in the discussion today on the International Peace Coalition. He's been one of the leading voices of exposing how Russiagate was instrumental in getting the proxy war against Ukraine going as part of the broader war against Russia. But it will also, the IPC meeting today will also feature the whistleblower Anthony Aguilar, who Maybe you've seen him on Tucker Carlson, but he's been a whistleblower for the war crimes being committed in Gaza, done both by the IDF and military contractors in general, US-based, some of them, and is an important voice in exposing the atrocities that are occurring in Gaza. But again, we need what Helga called for. We need the leaders of Russia, the United States, and China to sit down at the table, craft a new security and development architecture modeled on the principles that Helga LaRouche has put forward as the means to ensure peace and end the era of British geopolitics, which has been, pushed by their psychological warfare methods to get people to think that either a nuclear war is winnable, which is certainly insane, or that there's nothing you can do about it and therefore throw your hands up in the air. So join with the International Peace Coalition today. Join in circulating the LaRouche Organization white paper on exposing the true roots of the Russiagate operation, and stay tuned to the LaRouche Organization.